The cold steel of a spade slices into the earth. The priest stands over an open pit, casting a handful of dirt into the face of a living human being. He recites the separatio leprosorum, the mass of separation.
Ashes
Be thou
to ashes,
dead to the world,
dust
he chants,
to dust,
and alive only to God.
we commit this body to
This
the
was
ground.
not a nightmare. This was the brutal legal reality for lepers in the 12th century. A mandatory, living funeral that stripped a man of his property, his family, and his humanity. But in 1174, one boy cheated the shovel. Instead of a wooden clapper to warn people of his unclean presence, destiny handed him a sword. Instead of a colony of the damned, he was given the throne of Jerusalem. This is the harrowing true story of King Baldwin IV, the teenager who defied biology, logic, and the mightiest army the East had ever seen. While his own body was actively trying to kill him, rotting from the inside out, he stood as the lone shield against the rising tide of Saladin. How does a boy who cannot feel the reins of his horse crush a sultan who conquered empires? How does a king command respect when his face is slowly dissolving behind a veil of silk? Before he could fight the enemy at the gates, he had to win the war against his own silence. The nightmare did not begin on a battlefield amidst the clash of steel. It began in the innocent laughter of a playground. The year is 1170. Picture a group of young noble boys in the sun-drenched royal courtyard of Jerusalem. They are playing a rough game, a test of medieval toughness. They are digging their sharp fingernails into each other's arms to see who cries out first.
Ow, you really hurt me.
Boys
It's
scream.
throbbing.
They pull away. They rub their bruised
didn't
skin
push
with
that
tears
hard,
in their
honest.
eyes. But William of Tyre, the archdeacon and royal tutor, notices something disturbing. One boy is not reacting. Prince Baldwin. He's 9 years old. He isn't crying. He isn't flinching. He's laughing, convinced
What
he
have
is
you
winning
done
the
with it,
game
boy?
because he possesses a superior
Where is
will.
the relic?
William steps in, his heart
You must
pounding
remember
with a
your
sudden
studies, young
dark
master.
suspicion.
The
He
future
grabs the
depends on
prince's
it.
right arm. He doesn't
I
ask
understand,
questions.
Father.
He acts.
How can you
He
be
drives
so
his
calm?
fingernails deep
Does
into the
the wound
flesh
not
of the
trouble
boy's
you?
forearm,
It stings
harder
a
than
little,
any playmate would
but I
dare.
don't mind it.
The skin turns white, then red. Blood begins to pool. But the boy just looks up at him, confused by the tutor's intensity. "I feel nothing," Baldwin says. Those 3 words were a catastrophe, greater than any lost battle. William immediately recognized the symptoms. Lepra. The sensation in the boy's right arm
They cannot
and
know
hand
we were
was already
involved.
gone.
The evidence
In the
must
brutal
be burned
religious
tonight.
logic of the Middle Ages, this was
What
not
about
just
the
a
witness?
disease. It was a divine curse. It was a sign of God's disfavor, a one-way ticket to social exile. For a commoner, this meant a bell, a bowl, and banishment to a leper colony to rot. But Baldwin was not a commoner. He was the heir to the throne of Jerusalem. The High Court faced a terrifying dilemma. To admit the prince was a leper would be to admit the dynasty was cursed. So they made a choice born of desperation. They would hide the diagnosis. They would pretend the boy was fine, wrapping his numbness in silence and denial. But secrets in a royal court have a short
trembling
shelf
puppet.
life.
He looks
4
ready
years
to
later,
cry.
tragedy
Indeed.
struck.
This
King
regency will
Amalric,
be most
Baldwin's
necessary.
father, died of dysentery. The shield was gone. The year was 1174. Baldwin was 13 years old.
The contract
He was
settled
crowned
then.
King of Jerusalem in the Church of the
suspects
Holy
nothing.
Sepulchre.
Good.
But as the heavy gold
We
crown
strike
settled
at
on his
dawn.
head,
We
the
strike
atmosphere
at
in the
dawn.
cathedral
The kingdom
was not
will be
one of
ours to
celebration,
carve us as we
but of
see
impending doom.
Yes, brother.
The nobles looked at him and saw a placeholder king. They saw a walking corpse. They knew leprosy was a death sentence, usually
He
killing
lacks
its
the
victims
strength of
within
his
a
father.
few years of
The
the first
regency must be
symptoms.
extended,
The
perhaps
sharks began to
indefinitely.
circle
Indeed.
immediately.
He is
Powerful
far too
barons like
frail.
Raymond of Tripoli and the ambitious courtiers looked at the frail boy and began to sharpen their knives. They expected him to retire to a back room, to live out his short, painful days in prayer while they carved up the kingdom for themselves. They treated him like a fragile invalid, assuming a boy who could not feel his own hand could not possibly hold a sword. They assumed that because his body was numb, his spirit was weak. They were dead wrong. While Baldwin was struggling to come to terms with his own biology, a storm was gathering in the sands of Egypt. A new power had risen, one that would not wait for the boy king to grow up. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West simply as Saladin.
Look how the veil
He was not
hides
merely a
everything.
warlord.
We must
He was a
act before
visionary.
the council meets.
He had done the impossible by uniting the fractious Muslim states of Syria and Egypt, encircling the kingdom of Jerusalem in a stranglehold of iron. Saladin looked at the map of the Holy Land and saw a fragmented crusader state led by a sick child. He smelled blood. He did not see a threat. He saw a nuisance. He was convinced that the conquest of Jerusalem would be a formality, a simple matter of kicking in a rotten door. He was about to learn that the most dangerous opponent is a man who has nothing left to lose. By 1176, the regency was over. Baldwin IV turned 15. In the eyes of medieval law, he was a man. In the eyes of his enemies, he was a deteriorating invalid. The courtiers in Jerusalem expected him to retreat into the shadows, to remain a figurehead, while healthy men ran the war. They had prepared a life of comfortable irrelevance for him. But Baldwin did the one thing nobody expected. He rejected the comfort. He demanded the war. His first act as absolute ruler wasn't to call for doctors or priests. It was to call for his horse. And this is where the physical reality of his condition turns into a feat of engineering and sheer grit. We have to understand what it means to ride a war horse in the 12th century. It requires immense strength in the hands to grip the leather reins, to control 1,000 pounds of muscle and armored fury. Baldwin was losing the sensation in his hands. His grip was failing. The nerves were dying. So, he adapted. He learned to ride almost entirely with his knees. He trained his legs to become vices of iron, clamping onto the beast's flanks to steer and signal. This was not graceful riding. It was a brutal necessity. When his hands could no longer hold the sword securely, he didn't put the weapon down. He had his squires bind the hilt to his gauntlet, tying the steel to his flesh, so he literally could not drop it. Imagine the friction, the chafing of leather straps against skin that might be numb on the surface, but was rotting underneath. He turned his own body into a rigid extension of his military equipment. He forced his decaying body to obey his iron will, ignoring the silent screams of his damaged nerves. While Baldwin was strapping himself to his horse, Saladin made his first great mistake. The Sultan focused his attention on Aleppo and Mosul, fighting fellow Muslims to unify the caliphate. He turned his back on Jerusalem, confident that the sick boy would stay in bed. Baldwin saw Saladin's back turned, and he struck. He didn't just defend his borders, he launched a raid deep into the Bekaa Valley, the fertile heartland near Damascus. This wasn't a cautious patrol. It was an aggressive, lightning-fast cavalry assault. The Saracen governors were stunned. They scrambled to assemble defenses, but the invalid king moved with a speed that baffled them. He burned convoys, seized supplies, and disrupted the trade routes that fed Saladin's army. When the reports reached Saladin, he must have paused. The intelligence didn't make sense. A boy who was supposed to be dying was leading cavalry charges in the scorching heat of the Syrian summer. It defied medical logic. But Baldwin wasn't just fighting the Saracens. He was fighting the peace party within his own court. Many of the older barons, men who had grown rich and fat on trade, wanted to appease Saladin. They whispered that the king was too aggressive, that his illness made him reckless, that he was trying to die a glorious death and would take the kingdom with him. Baldwin ignored them. He understood something they didn't. Time was his enemy. He knew his body was a crumbling fortress. He didn't have 30 years to play diplomatic chess. He had maybe 5 years, maybe 10. He had to break Saladin's power now, or there would be no kingdom left to inherit. This urgency created a terrifying duality in his character. To his people, he was a saintly figure, suffering for their sins. But to his commanders, he was demanding and relentless. He rode at the front, and the sight of him, a figure wrapped in bandages, sitting upright on a war horse, became a psychological weapon. It shamed the healthy knights. If the Leper King could ride into the arrow storm, what excuse did they have? By November 1177, the training wheels were off. The skirmishes in the Bekaa Valley were just a warm-up. Saladin had finished his business in the north. He had united Syria and Egypt, closing the pincer around the Christian kingdom. He turned his full gaze back to Jerusalem, annoyed that the child king had been biting at his heels. Saladin gathered an army of 26,000 men, Mamluks, Kurdish cavalry, and Sudanese infantry. It was a massive invasion force designed to crush the kingdom of Jerusalem in a single season.
We may be few,
Against this tidal wave, Baldwin managed to scrape together a desperate coalition. He had barely 500 knights. The stage was set for a massacre. The advisors begged Baldwin to stay behind the walls of Jerusalem to withstand a siege. It was the sensible tactical choice. But Baldwin knew that a siege would just be a slow death, exactly like his disease. He chose the open field. He mustered every man who could hold a spear and rode south to the fortress city of Ascalon. It was a gamble that terrified his generals. By moving south, he left Jerusalem vulnerable. But Saladin was a master strategist. When he saw Baldwin hole up inside the walls of Ascalon, he smiled. To Saladin, this confirmed everything he suspected. The Leper King was afraid. The boy had hidden behind stone walls to die safely. Saladin decided not to waste time laying siege to Ascalon. Why bother crushing a dying spider when you can just burn its web? Saladin made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ignored Baldwin. He marched his massive army past Ascalon, heading straight for the ultimate prize, Jerusalem itself. The holy city was undefended. The road was open. Confidence turned into arrogance. Believing there was no army left to stop him, Saladin allowed his tight military formation to break apart. He gave the order to disperse.
Watch the ropes back
Like
there.
a pack of wolves let off the leash, his soldiers scattered across the countryside to pillage. They were not marching for battle. They were marching for a parade. They moved slowly, drunk on the certainty of victory. Their weapons packed away in baggage trains, their armor unbuckled in the heat. Inside Ascalon, Baldwin watched the smoke rising from the burning villages. He saw the enemy bypassing him. He realized that Jerusalem was hours away from destruction. He had a choice. He could stay in Ascalon, survive the war, and watch his kingdom burn from the safety of a tower. Or he could leave the walls.
Open the gates.
To leave the walls
I
meant to
must
take a
go to
few
the
hundred
desert
knights
now.
into the open desert
Do as
against
I command.
thousands. It was suicide. But Baldwin was a man who had lived with the specter of death since he was 9 years old. Death did not scare him. Dishonor did.
Deus vult.
He ordered
For
the
the
gates of
glory of the
Ascalon to
temple,
open.
charge.
The Templars, led by the fanatical Odo de Saint-Amand, joined him. Together with Baldwin's secular knights, they numbered barely 500 heavy cavalry. They were outnumbered more than 50 to 1. They rode north, shadowing Saladin's sprawling, disorganized army. They moved along the coast, hidden by the rolling dunes and the glare of the sun. It was a ghost march. No war drums, no trumpets, just the muffled thud of hooves on sand and the labored breathing of a king who was tied to his saddle to keep from slumping over. The pain for Baldwin during this ride is unimaginable. The friction of the saddle on his numb, ulcerated skin would be causing damage he couldn't even feel until he looked down and saw blood soaking his robes. But his mind was sharp. He knew Saladin was currently crossing a ravine near a place called Montgisard. The geography was crucial. Montgisard was a choke point. To cross the Wadi, the dry riverbed, Saladin's army had to funnel through tight spaces. They were vulnerable, but only if Baldwin struck at the exact right second. As the sun began to dip in the afternoon sky on November 25th, the Crusader scouts crested a hill. Below them, spread out like a vast, chaotic carpet, lay the army of Saladin. They were completely unaware. They were washing themselves in the stream. They were feeding their horses. They were resting. Baldwin halted his horse. The moment had arrived. But before the signal charge was given, something happened that transcends military history and enters the realm of legend.
Steady, Your Highness.
The Bishop of
Lean
Bethlehem
on
stepped
us.
forward,
Almost
carrying
there.
a piece of wood
We
encased
have
in
you.
gold. The true cross. The relic believed to be the very timber upon which Christ died. Baldwin, the boy with the rotting face, struggled down from his horse. He could not stand easily. He fell to his knees in the sand before the cross, and in front of his hardened knights, men who had killed and seen their friends killed, the king began to weep. He didn't pray for victory. He prayed for salvation. He begged God not to let the kingdom
Please,
fall
God,
because of his
save
own
me
sins,
from this suffering.
his own sickness.
I beg
It
you,
was a
show
moment
me
of raw,
mercy.
naked vulnerability. The knights watched their broken king crying in the dust, and something shifted in their hearts. They were no longer fighting for land. They were no longer fighting for loot. They were fighting for him. When Baldwin stood up, the tears were gone. He was helped back onto his horse. His face, usually hidden or averted, turned to his men. He didn't give a long speech. He simply pointed his bandaged hand toward the sea of enemies below. The 500 knights lowered their visors. The 500 lances dropped into position. They were a steel wedge aimed directly at the throat of the unsuspecting giant. The charge of a medieval heavy cavalry unit is not like anything in modern warfare. It is a single, catastrophic, kinetic event. Imagine 500 tanks with no brakes accelerating downhill. When Baldwin's knights hit the disorganized Saracen lines, the sound was reportedly deafening. The crunch of metal, the shattering of wood, and the screams of men caught completely unaware. The element of surprise was absolute. Saladin's soldiers were scattered. Some were still putting on their armor. Others were trying to mount their horses. The Crusaders didn't give them a second. They smashed through the baggage train and drove straight into the heart of the enemy formation. The sheer momentum of the charge vaporized the Saracen resistance. At the center of this storm rode King Baldwin IV. Historical accounts vary on whether he was physically wielding a sword or simply guiding his men with the true cross held high beside him, but the psychological effect was the same. To the Muslim soldiers, this was a ghost. This was the boy their sultan had dismissed as a corpse. And yet here he was, riding out of the sunset like an avenging angel. Panic spread like wildfire. The leper is here! The leper is here! The numerical advantage of 26,000 men evaporated instantly. In ancient warfare, numbers only matter if you can organize them. Saladin couldn't. His army dissolved into a chaotic stampede. The narrow geography of the Wadi, which should have protected them, now became a death trap. They were bottled up, unable to maneuver, cut down by the relentless fury of the Templars and Baldwin's royal guard. In the middle of the slaughter, Saladin himself, the great unifier of Islam, faced a humiliating reality. His personal bodyguards, the elite Mamluks, fought bravely to buy him time. They formed a ring of steel around him and were slaughtered to the last man. They died so their sultan could run. And run he did. The history books record a detail that is almost cinematic in its indignity. Saladin did not retreat on his warhorse. In the chaos, he was forced to leap onto a racing camel. He fled into the desert night, abandoning his army, his baggage, and his pride. He rode so hard and so fast that by the time he reached safety in Egypt, only a handful of his followers were still with him. The Battle of Montgisard was not just a victory, it was an annihilation. It was the greatest military upset of the Middle Ages. A 16-year-old boy with a rotting body had destroyed the most powerful army in the known world. When the dust settled at Montgisard, the magnitude of the miracle became clear. The Crusaders captured the Sultan's entire camp. They had broken the back of the Ayyubid army. But the cost of the victory was not just measured in dead knights or broken lances. It was measured in the king's flesh. The adrenaline that had sustained Baldwin through the charge began to fade, and the biological bill came due. The physical exertion of riding in heavy armor for hours, the shocks of combat, the dehydration,
Long live
it
the
all
king.
accelerated his condition.
Grant us your blessing.
He had pushed his body far beyond its breaking point. He
Blessings
returned to
upon the
Jerusalem,
king.
a hero. The bells of the Holy Sepulchre rang out. People knelt in the streets as he passed, some believing that his leprosy was a sign of divine favor, that he was suffering like Christ so they could be saved. But as the armor was peeled off his body in the privacy of his chambers, the truth was horrifying. The lesions had spread. The numbness had crept further up his limbs. He had traded months of his life for one day of victory. Saladin, humiliated and furious, learned a lesson he would never forget. He realized that as long as this cursed boy drew breath, Jerusalem would not fall. He famously said, "God doesn't want the Christians to lose this land while this king is alive." But the tragedy of Baldwin is that his greatest victory was also the beginning of his end. The clock was ticking faster now. We are now entering the phase of his life that Hollywood movies often gloss over or sanitize. They give him a shiny silver mask and a mysterious aura. But the reality of lepromatous leprosy, the specific aggressive form Baldwin suffered from, is not mysterious. It is biological cruelty in its purest form. By his late teens, the handsome boy who had laughed in the courtyard was gone. The disease had begun to dismantle his face. The bacteria, Mycobacterium leprae, targets the cooler parts of the body first. This means the fingers, the toes, and the center of the face. The cartilage of his nose began to dissolve, leading to a condition known as saddle nose deformity, where the bridge collapses inward. His lips likely retracted, exposing his teeth and gums in a permanent skull-like grin. This is the point where the historical debate about the mask comes in. Did he wear a silver mask, like Edward Norton in the movie Kingdom of Heaven? There is no contemporary evidence for a metal mask. Instead, chroniclers describe him covering his face with heavy silk veils or drapery. He hid his face not to create an aura of power, but to spare his subjects the horror of looking at their king. The mask in the movie is a superhero costume. The veil in history was a shroud for the living, but the visual horror was secondary to the sensory deprivation. Leprosy is a disease of silence and darkness. It kills the nerves. Baldwin was slowly going blind, not just because the bacteria attacked his eyes, but because the muscles in his eyelids were paralyzed. He couldn't blink. His eyes remained permanently open, drying out, ulcerating, and eventually turning opaque. Imagine trying to read maps, study reports, or judge the expressions of your advisors while your vision blurs into gray static. Imagine the torment of eyes that cannot close, even when you sleep. And then, there was the smell. As the flesh on his extremities began to die, gangrene would set in. The King of Jerusalem, the most powerful man in the Holy Land, rotted while he sat on his throne. The scent of decaying meat would have filled the council chamber. His advisors, men of high nobility, had to stand close to him to whisper state secrets, forcing themselves not to gag, not to flinch, not to show the revulsion that any human being would naturally feel. This creates a psychological isolation that is almost impossible to comprehend. Baldwin was a young man, barely 20. He had the same desires, the same sharp intellect, and the same emotional needs as any other young man. But he was untouchable, literally. To touch him was to risk ritual uncleanness or infection. Although modern science knows leprosy is not easily transmitted, to them, he was a prisoner in a cage of dying flesh. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone.
Silence!
Yet in this
move
darkness,
quickly.
his mind burned brighter
I
than
will
ever.
not be late.
As his body failed, his will hardened. He refused to abdicate. A lesser man would have retired to a leper colony, accepted his fate, and died in obscurity. Baldwin forced his broken body to attend every council meeting. When he could no longer hold a pen to sign decrees, he had stamps made. When he could no longer walk, he was carried in a litter. He became a voice in the dark, a disembodied intellect governing a kingdom on the brink of apocalypse. He proved that a king is not defined by his limbs, but by his presence. A king needs more than a mind to rule. He needs a future. He needs an heir. And this was the ultimate silent tragedy of Baldwin's reign. The disease had taken his ability to father children long before it took his fingers. He was sterile. The future of the dynasty and the fate of the Holy Land rested entirely on his sisters, primarily his older sister, Sibylla. Baldwin knew he was dying. The fever dreams were becoming more frequent, the darkness in his eyes more absolute. He needed a strong brother-in-law, a warrior who could act as regent and eventually king. He needed a new sword to replace his own useless arm. Enter Guy de Lusignan. History has not been kind to Guy, and for good reason. He was a French knight from a minor noble
This
family,
marriage is vital.
arriving in the Holy
He is
Land
handsome,
with little more
devoted,
than
and
his
the people
name and his
already love
appearance.
him. Say
He possessed
yes, Your
striking
Majesty.
good looks,
By the
flowing
authority
hair,
vested in me,
and the broad shoulders
do
of a
you
hero.
take this woman?
But beneath the armor,
I
he
do.
was utterly
I
hollow.
do.
He was the polar opposite of Baldwin, healthy, handsome, and completely devoid of military intelligence or political nuance.
You have gone
Sibylla,
too far this
perhaps
time,
driven
my
by the
lord.
same physical
It is
desires
you
her
who
brother was
threatens
denied,
the balance.
fell in
we
love
will
with him.
not yield.
Or perhaps she
Mock
was
us with these
manipulated by her
demands,
mother,
Lord. Peace,
Agnes of
friend.
Courtenay.
Diplomacy
Either
requires
way,
a steady
against
hand,
the advice
not a
of his
quick
wisest
blade.
lords, Baldwin consented to the marriage in 1180. It was a decision made out of desperation. Baldwin felt the cold breath of
and
death on
loot.
his neck.
That
He
is what
panicked,
we are owed.
hoping that by securing a
Now
husband for
we
Sibylla,
take
he was securing the kingdom's
The
stability.
drought is your fault,
He was
monarch.
wrong.
You have angered the gods.
As soon as
Do
Guy
not
de
listen to
Lusignan
him,
got
he is a
close to the
traitor.
throne,
We
the
demand
unity of
justice now.
Jerusalem began to fracture. The court split into two vicious factions that hated each other almost as much as they hated Saladin.
He is
On
truly
one
the
side
pride
was
of
the
kingdom.
noble party, led by
We are
Raymond of
simply
Tripoli and the
captivated by
Ibelin
his
family.
presence, Your Grace.
These were men born in the East, who spoke Arabic, understood the delicate balance of power, and knew that survival meant occasional diplomacy. On the other side was the court party, the aggressive newcomers led by Guy and the infamous Renaud of Châtillon. These men saw the local customs as weak. They wanted war, glory, and loot. They looked at the Muslims not as neighbors to be managed, but as enemies to be exterminated. Baldwin, blind and crippled, found
must
himself
take
trapped in a
command.
nightmare.
There is no one
He had
else.
spent his life fighting Saladin to buy peace for his people, only to realize that the people he was handing the keys to were incompetent warmongers. The living corpse on the throne could see the danger clearly, while the healthy men around him were blind with ambition. And Saladin, he was watching.
Merchants
He saw
to
the
front.
Leper King fading.
Commoners, hold
He
the
saw
line.
the fool guy
Move
rising,
out.
and he began to sharpen his sword again. The miracle of Montgisard was a distant memory. The reckoning was coming. By 1183, the situation exploded. Saladin crossed into the Galilee, burning villages and taunting the Christians. Baldwin, physically incapacitated, had formally handed the regency, the day-to-day military command to Guy. This was the moment the court party had been waiting for. Finally, a healthy man was in charge. Guy mustered the largest Crusader army ever assembled in the history of the kingdom. The levy was absolute. Every knight, every foot soldier, every merchant who could hold a spear was there.
order immediately!
The armies met at the pools of Goliath. The Crusaders
men are
held the high
breaking
ground.
ranks because of
The
your
water
vanity.
sources were in their control.
The enemy holds position.
Saladin was exposed
Break camp
below.
and move the
The
army
knights,
south.
veterans of Montgisard,
Maintain
gripped
formation.
their lances, waiting for the order to charge. They waited, and they waited. Guy froze. Whether it was cowardice,
The butcher of
indecision,
Kerak!
or a fear that
He
his own
deserves
barons
worse
wouldn't
than
follow
this.
him, he refused to give the order. He stood there paralyzed,
Your
while
Majesty,
Saladin's army
I
maneuvered,
bring grave news
skirmished,
from the capital.
and eventually,
The council has
seeing that
seized
the
power,
Crusaders were
and they have
rooted to the
denounced
spot
your
like
rule.
statues, simply packed up and left. Saladin raided the countryside, filled his coffers with loot, and retreated without a scratch. It was a military disgrace. To the medieval mind, refusing battle when you have the advantage is worse than losing. It is a sign of moral bankruptcy. The army returned to Jerusalem in shame, the soldiers spitting on the ground when Guy's name was mentioned. When the news reached the blind, bedridden king in Jerusalem, something terrifying happened. The corpse woke up. Baldwin's fury was absolute. He had dragged his broken body into the saddle for a decade to protect his people. And now, this healthy, arrogant fool had squandered the greatest army Jerusalem had ever seen without swinging a sword. Baldwin realized he had made a fatal mistake. He had prioritized bloodline over competence. He knew, with the crystal clarity that comes to the dying, that if Guy remained in power, the kingdom would fall. What followed was one of the most dramatic political maneuvers in medieval history. Baldwin, who could barely speak above a whisper, summoned the High Court. He ordered them to strip Guy of the regency. It was a humiliation. Guy, furious, fled to his estates in Ascalon. But Baldwin wasn't done. He needed to secure the succession, and he needed to do it now. He turned to his nephew, Sibylla's son from her first marriage, a 5-year-old boy also named Baldwin. The coronation of little Baldwin V in November. 1183 is a scene of heartbreaking symbolism. King Baldwin IV was too weak to stand. He was carried into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on a litter. The crown was placed on the head of the bewildered 5-year-old child. But the child was too small to be seen by the crowd. So Balian of Ibelin, a tall, noble knight who represented the best of the Crusader ideal, stepped forward. He lifted the child onto his shoulders. For the entire ceremony, the little king sat on the shoulders of the knight, towering over the assembly, while the dying king lay on a stretcher in the shadows. It was a desperate final gamble. Baldwin IV was trying to build a wall around the throne to keep Guy out. He appointed Raymond of Tripoli as regent for the child. He made the barons swear that Guy would never rule. Baldwin was trying to rule from the grave before he was even in it. Baldwin knew his time was up. He had weeks, maybe months left. But Saladin was not done. Hearing of the internal chaos and the disgraced regency of Guy, the Sultan decided to strike one more time. And this time, he aimed for the very heart of the nobility. He attacked the fortress of Kerak during a royal wedding. It is late 1183. In the fortress of Kerak, perched high on the ridges east of the Dead Sea, a bizarre spectacle is unfolding. Princess Isabella, Baldwin's younger half-sister, is marrying Humphrey of Turan. Inside the Great Hall, there is music, dancing, and wine. Outside, there is the thundering crash of heavy artillery. Saladin has surrounded the castle. He has brought 9 massive trebuchets, gravity-powered catapults capable of hurling stones the size of men. As the wedding guests dance, the walls shake. Dust falls from the ceiling into their wine goblets. The screams of the dying on the ramparts mix with the melodies of the lute. This siege provides one of the most fascinating glimpses into the strange code of chivalry that existed between these mortal enemies. According to the chroniclers, the mother of the groom, Lady Etiennette, sent platters of food from the wedding feast out to Saladin's tent, roast meats and delicacies, with a message: "The groom and bride greet you." Saladin, not to be outdone in courtesy, asked which tower the newlyweds were sleeping in. Once identified, he ordered his siege engineers to aim their bombardment at every part of the castle except that specific tower. So, while the rest of the fortress was being pulverized into gravel, the bridal suite remained a peaceful island in a sea of destruction. But chivalry does not win wars. The garrison at Kerak was starving. They were trapped. They sent desperate messengers slipping through the lines to Jerusalem, begging for help. In the capital, the signal fires were lit. The kingdom mobilized, but who would lead them? Guy de Lusignan had been disgraced. The other barons were bickering like children. There was only one man with the moral authority to unite the fractious army. King Baldwin ordered his servants to prepare him for travel. By now, he could not sit a horse. He could not even sit upright in a carriage without agonizing pain. His body was a mass of open sores and decaying bone, so he ordered a litter to be constructed, a stretcher carried between two horses. The image is searing. The army of Jerusalem marches out, thousands of knights in glittering mail, lances held high. And in the center of this steel column, there is no king on a white stallion. There is just a box with curtains swaying gently in the heat. Inside lies a blind, decaying man, his body wrapped in bandages, his mind projecting a force of will that held the entire army together. They marched across the desert to Kerak. When Saladin's scouts reported the approach of the relief force, they brought strange news. They didn't report a new general. They reported the king's litter. Saladin knew exactly what that meant. He knew that Baldwin had dragged his dying body across the wilderness to face him one last time. In a move that has puzzled and fascinated historians for centuries, Saladin did not fight. He had the superior position. He had the numbers. He could have forced a battle. But upon hearing that Baldwin was personally commanding the relief force, Saladin ordered a retreat. Why? Was it fear? Unlikely. Saladin was a seasoned warrior who feared no man. It was respect, and perhaps a bit of superstition. He had seen what this cursed boy could do at Montgisard. He knew that the morale of the Crusader army was unbreakable when the Leper King was with them. To fight them now, fueled by the fanaticism of protecting their dying martyr king, would be to invite disaster. Saladin lifted the siege. He packed up his trebuchets and withdrew into the haze. Baldwin was carried into Kerak, not as a conqueror, but as a savior. The wedding guests, who had been preparing for death or starvation, cheered as the litter passed through the gates. But for Baldwin, there was no celebration. This was his final act. He had used the last ounce of his vitality to save his sister and his kingdom. The journey back to Jerusalem was a funeral procession for a living man. He returned to the capital, his body shattered by the journey. The fever consumed him. The end was no longer a distant threat. It was a matter of days. Spring 1185. The almond trees were blooming in Jerusalem, but inside the royal palace, the air was heavy with the scent of death. King Baldwin IV was 24 years old. He had reigned for 11 years. 11 years longer than any doctor had predicted. But the biological bill had finally come due. The end did not come on a battlefield with a sword in hand, as he might have wished. It came in a bed, surrounded by priests and conspiring courtiers. The infection had overwhelmed his internal organs. He was blind, immobile, and in constant, excruciating pain. On March 16, 1185, the Leper King took his final breath. For Baldwin, death was not a tragedy. It was a mercy. It was the first moment in nearly 2 decades that he was not in pain. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre near the hill of Golgotha. It is a profound historical rhyme. A king who suffered in his flesh, buried just feet away from where Christ was believed to have suffered on the cross. But while Baldwin found peace, his kingdom found chaos. The moment his heart stopped, the delicate web of alliances he had spun to protect Jerusalem began to unravel. According to Baldwin's will, the crown passed to his nephew, the child Baldwin V. Count Raymond of Tripoli was appointed regent to protect the boy. For a brief moment, it seemed that Baldwin IV's plan might work. The kingdom held its breath. Saladin, respecting the truce he had signed with the Leper King, and perhaps out of respect for the adversary he had just lost, stayed his hand. But fate was not done with the House of Jerusalem. In the summer of 1186, just 1 year after his uncle's death, the little King Baldwin V sickened and died. He was only 9 years old. The throne was empty. The buffer was gone. And the wolves didn't just howl, they broke down the door. This led to the coup of 1186, a political betrayal that sealed the fate of the Crusader states. Sibylla, Baldwin IV's sister, was the rightful heir. But the High Court had a condition. They knew Guy de Lusignan was incompetent. They knew Baldwin IV had despised him. They demanded she divorce Guy before they would crown her. They told her she could choose a new, capable husband to lead the armies after the coronation. Sibylla agreed. She swore a solemn oath to divorce Guy. The barons, relieved, agreed. They crowned her Queen of Jerusalem. Then, in a moment that shocked the entire kingdom, Sibylla played her hand. Standing before the High Court, the fresh crown on her head, she announced her choice for her new husband. She chose Guy de Lusignan. She took the crown meant for a consort and placed it on his head herself. It was a masterstroke of manipulation and a disaster for Christendom. She had tricked the council. She had handed absolute power back to the very man Baldwin IV had spent his dying days trying to block. When the news reached the other Crusader lords, Baldwin of Ibelin, one of the Leper King's most loyal captains, refused to serve Guy. He famously said, "I will not kiss the hand of a man who destroyed the kingdom." He exiled himself rather than watch the inevitable collapse. Guy de Lusignan was now king. He was weak, easily manipulated, and desperate to prove himself. And waiting in the desert was Reynald of Châtillon, the rogue baron who acted like a medieval terrorist. Reynald hated Muslims with a pathological fury. With Baldwin IV dead and Guy too weak to stop him, Reynald broke the truce. He attacked a massive Muslim caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus. He slaughtered the merchants, stole the goods, and threw the survivors into his dungeons. Saladin demanded restitution. He demanded the prisoners back. King Guy, terrified of Reynald, did nothing. He couldn't control his own vassals. Saladin had the excuse he needed. The truce was broken. The Leper King was dead. The God-protected barrier was gone. Saladin declared jihad. He summoned every warrior from the Nile to the Euphrates. This wasn't a raid. It was the endgame. In July 1187, the massive Saracen army crossed the river. The shadow of the Leper King was fading, and the scorching sun of Hattin was rising. King Guy, ignoring the defensive strategies that Baldwin IV had used for years, decided to march out to meet Saladin. It was the decision of a man terrified of being called a coward, and it cost him an empire. He marched his army into the arid, waterless plateau of Hattin. He walked straight into the trap that Baldwin IV had avoided for a decade. July 4th, 1187. The heat in the Galilean hills is suffocating. It is the height of summer. King Guy has made the catastrophic error of marching his army away from the springs of Sepphoris towards Tiberias. They are walking into a furnace. Saladin, watching from the hills, cannot believe his luck. He orders his men to set fire to the dry brush surrounding the Crusaders. Now, the knights are not just fighting thirst. They are fighting smoke, heat, and exhaustion. Their heavy chainmail, once their greatest defense, has become a torture device, cooking them alive in the sun. By the time they reach the horns of Hattin, an extinct volcano with twin peaks, the army of Jerusalem is broken. They haven't drunk water in days. Men are collapsing, horses are dying, and then the arrows begin to rain down. The Battle of Hattin was not a fight. It was an execution. The disorganized, dehydrated Crusaders were slaughtered. The infantry tried to flee up the slopes and were cut down. The knights were pulled from their horses and butchered. In the center of the carnage, the unthinkable happened. The Bishop of Acre, carrying the true cross, was killed. The golden casing was smashed open. The sacred relic, the wood that Baldwin IV had wept before at Montgisard, was seized by Saladin's troops. To the Christians, this was worse than death. It was the death of God himself. King Guy was captured. He was dragged to Saladin's tent, thirsty and trembling. In a famous scene, Saladin offered the terrified king a cup of iced rose water, a sign that his life would be spared. But when Guy tried to pass the cup to Renaud of Châtillon, Saladin stopped him. "I did not give him water," Saladin said. The Sultan then stood up, drew his scimitar, and personally beheaded Renaud. Justice for the caravan raids was served. Guy was spared, but he was dragged away in chains, a king without a kingdom. With the army destroyed, Jerusalem was defenseless. There were no knights left. Only the women, children, and the elderly remained behind the walls. The only nobleman left was Balian of Ibelin, who had escaped Hattin. He rode into the city to organize a desperate defense. Balian knighted every boy over the age of 16 and every merchant who could hold a sword. But it was a hopeless fight. Saladin arrived with his massive army on September 20th. The siege lasted less than 2 weeks. The walls were breached. The game was over. On October 2nd, 1187, Balian surrendered the city. But here lies the final haunting contrast between the era of the Crusades and the character of Saladin. In 1099, when the first Crusaders took Jerusalem, they had waded in blood up to their ankles, slaughtering every Muslim and Jew in the city. The Christians inside fearfully expected Saladin to return the favor. He did not. Saladin allowed the Christians to ransom themselves. Those who could pay walked free. Those who couldn't were enslaved, yes, but there was no general massacre. The churches were not burned. They were converted back into mosques or left alone. Saladin walked through the streets of the captured city. He visited the tomb of Baldwin IV. We don't know exactly what he thought, but he left the tomb untouched. While he tore down the crosses from the dome of the rock, he allowed the Leper King to rest in peace. It was a silent acknowledgement from one great warrior to another. The kingdom of Jerusalem, as Baldwin knew it, was gone. It had lasted 88 years, and in the end, it wasn't destroyed by the strength of its enemies, but by the weakness of its own leaders, who failed to heed the lessons of the dying boy who had once saved them. Baldwin IV had held back the tide with a broken hand. Guy de Lusignan had opened the floodgates with a healthy one. But today, nearly 1,000 years after his death, King Baldwin IV has achieved a strange kind of immortality that no one could have predicted. If you open TikTok, YouTube Shorts, or Instagram Reels right now, you will find him. You will see clips from Ridley Scott's 2005 movie Kingdom of Heaven, set to pounding electronic music, with captions calling him a Sigma male or the ultimate symbol of willpower. Why? Why does a leper king from the 12th century resonate so deeply with the modern digital generation? Perhaps it is because we live in an age of curated perfection. We are bombarded daily with images of flawless bodies, filtered lives, and performative happiness. Baldwin represents the exact opposite. He represents the triumph of the spirit over a flawed, broken reality. He is the anti-victim. He had every excuse in the world to give up, to hide, to blame God or the universe. But he didn't. He played a terrible hand of cards with absolute mastery. However, as we close this chapter, we must separate the Hollywood myth from the historical man. The silver mask, that iconic, emotionless face that has become his symbol on the internet, is almost certainly a fiction invented by Ridley Scott. History tells us he hid his face behind veils and drapery, not metal. Does this diminish him? No. It makes him more human. The mask in the movie is cool. It's a superhero costume. But the veil is tragic. It is the desperate attempt of a young man to hold on to his dignity while his face falls apart. To ride into battle wearing a stifling veil, blind in one eye, with bleeding sores rubbing against his armor, is infinitely more heroic than wearing a cool silver mask. Baldwin IV teaches us a lesson in stoicism that Marcus Aurelius would have admired. He shows us that we cannot control what happens to our bodies. We cannot control the time we are born in or the enemies we face. We can only control our response. He teaches us that true authority does not come from physical strength or a loud voice. It comes from presence. It comes from the willingness to suffer alongside your people. When he ordered his litter to be carried into the sands of Kerak, he wasn't just a general giving orders. He was a symbol that said, I am still here. I am still standing, even if I have to lie down to do it. Jerusalem fell. The stones crumbled. The Crusades are viewed today through a complex, often bloody lens. But the figure of the Leper King rises above the politics and the violence. He remains a testament to the terrifying power of the human will. So, the next time you feel overwhelmed by the unfairness of life, remember the boy who felt nothing in his right arm and yet held the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. Remember the funeral that never happened and the funeral procession that saved a city. And remember that sometimes the face we show the world is less important than the fire that burns behind it. Baldwin IV's life forces us to confront a difficult question. If a man with an expiration date stamped on his flesh could achieve immortality through sheer will, what is stopping us? We often let minor setbacks define our days, while he refused to let a death sentence define his life. His story is not just about a war for Jerusalem, it is about the eternal war for the self. It reminds us that while we cannot choose our burdens, we can always choose how we carry them. I want to hear from you in the comments. What is the Saladin in your life right now? What is the challenge you feel is too big to defeat? Let's turn the comment section into a testament to resilience. Share your battles, big or small. I read every story. If this deep dive into the tragic and heroic life of the Leper King resonated with you, please honor his legacy by hitting that like button. It helps these forgotten histories rise from the sands of time. Make sure you are subscribed and have the bell notification turned on so you don't miss our next documentary. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength. Until next time.